Selamat pagi buat Bapak Ibu sekalian. Kita akan mendengarkan terkait dengan topik yang akan kita presentasikan mengenai jalur rempah dan juga rempah di Timur Tengah dan juga di Eropa. Saya akan membacakan CV dari Elaine van Dalen. Elaine van Dalen is Assistant Professor of Classical Islamic Studies in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University. Please unmute the participant. Thank you. She is a philologist working on medical, botanical, and agricultural texts from the classical Islamic world. Her research questions revolve around the transmission and the translation of knowledge, history of scholarship and writing, history of ideas, and philosophy of science. Professor van Dalen received her PhD in Classics and in Science History from the University of Manchester in 2017. And she also obtained BA degrees from Leiden University in the Netherlands and MA in Middle Eastern Studies from the American University in Cairo. Before joining Columbia University, van Dalen taught at the Universities of Edinburgh and Manchester, and she was also postdoctoral fellow at Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium until 2018, and she is currently completing her first monograph which explores the social function of the medical commentary in classical Islamic medical teaching and research. She's also writing on topics related to early Islamic botanical theory and classical Islamic medical philology, and she has articles forthcoming on epistemology in the Nabatean agriculture and the medieval Hebrew witnesses of the Arabic Palladius. So she also published some articles on pediatrics in classical Islamic theory, and the other is on the subjectivity in translation. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, 9th century interpretation of Galen's ego in his commentary on the Hippocratic aphorism. So we would like to learn a lot about your scholarship related to our topic today, Cosmopolitanism of Islam Nusantara, but especially, of course, about the Islamic civilization in the classical period related to manuscript tradition. Please, the time is yours.
Thank you so much for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I have prepared some slides. Can I share my screen with you? Does this work?
We're still waiting to see the screen. Yes.
Okay, you see the slides. Okay. So I want to talk about. Wait, I don't think this is good. I want to stop. I want to share again. Yes, this is correct. So I want to speak about three topics. I first want to give a general overview of medicine, Islamic medicine in the classical period, so from the 9th to around 14th centuries. And after I give that introduction, I want to speak specifically about drugs and medicines that were used and draw attention to innovations as a result of the cosmopolitanism at this time and the influence of new spices coming from places like India, China, and Indonesia. So I hope to give you some examples of that. I want to first begin with explaining the concept of Greco-Arabic medicine. in the 9th century, what happened is we see a continuation of Greek medicine as it was practiced in major centers such as Alexandria in late antiquity, which involved a theory of medicine which built on Hippocratic and Galenic material from centuries before, which educated medical students following medical curriculum that was also studied in Alexandria in earlier centuries. So this included a number of Galenic and Hippocratic books. It followed a method of rational empiricism, which was used by Galen, and it involved practice such as different dietary treatment, drugs, surgery, cupping, and bloodletting. Now, an important instigator of this tradition was the Abbasid translation movement. As the language of the new Abbasid Empire and earlier the Umayyad Empire changed into Arabic, a lot of scholarly works, when I say a lot, I mean most available scholarly works were translated from Greek, but also Persian and Sanskrit and Syriac into Arabic, also into Syriac, which was still used in the beginning. Now, this was very widely supported by caliphs, members of the elite, prominent scholars, and Nestorian Christians, Byzantines, Persians, all worked in this movement to translate texts into Arabic, among which a lot of Galen's work, a lot of Hippocrates' works from Greek into Arabic, for example, by a translator called Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who lived from 808 until 873. He was an Nestorian Syriac-speaking Christian who studied more Greek in Byzantium and who translated all of Galen's work into Arabic. Also some from Syriac, also from Greek, and he also translated some Hippocratic works. On the left, you see an example of Galen's on the usefulness of the parts, which was first translated into Syriac, then from Syriac into Arabic by Hunayn's nephew, and then again revised by him. So in this way, a lot of Greek material that was studied before became accessible in Arabic from the 9th century onwards and continue to be studied. I just have this map of the period to show you the extent of the empire, the Abbasid Empire at the time, in which the physicians that I'm talking about today worked. But you will see that the influence and scholarly exchanges crossed outside of these boundaries as well. This is another example, a very famous work by the Greek physician Hippocrates, who he was seen as one physician often. He had a collection of aphorisms that was translated into Syriac and Arabic, and here you see both the Syriac in one column and then Arabic on the other. And this was read and studied by many students. Now, after these translations, the medical discipline develops, and you have a range of physicians from a variety of religious backgrounds. So in the beginning, these first centuries, 9th century onwards, a lot of physicians are Christian, but also increasingly Muslim. There's Jewish physicians and Sabian, and they all work together in this growing paradigm of text translated from Greek. Now, major physicians that I want to mention in this tradition is Rabban al-Tabari, who wrote an early encyclopedia, the Firdaus al-Hikmah, Razi, famous physician, al-Majusi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn al-Nafis, who all, among many others, wrote influential medical works. The canon, of course, is a very famous example of Ibn Sina, which I'll come back to in a bit. So these physicians really established a medical discipline in which they worked building on existing theories, as I said, from Greek, but introducing their own interpretations and developing that further. To understand, as we're working towards the topic of drugs and practice, we need to understand a little bit how these physicians understood the body and disease and health. First of all, they saw medicine as an art that preserves health and removes disease. But what was the body and what was disease? The body was thought to consist of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, and yellow bile and black bile, which together mixed into a mixture, which when it was in balance, meant the person was healthy. But if there was an imbalance, if there was more blood than supposed to be, or more phlegm, or too little black bile, there would be a disease, right? There would be an imbalance of humors. Also, you could have a structural problem with one of the organs or limbs, and of course that would be a disease as well. This imbalance could be influenced by someone's age or their sex. Being man or a woman had this particular influence on the humors you had, but also non-natural causes such as the food you eat, the way you sleep, rest, exercise, your mood, and the air that you breathe. Right, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, but at that time when there were epidemics, it was thought to result from corrupted air that people breathe. I won't get into that topic today. So this system, the human body, was paralleled in the cosmos. So also in different seasons that were themselves could be hot and cold, but also with the stars and planets beyond the Earth, and also more locally in foods and drinks. So just as a human body consisted of humors that were parallel to particular elements, such as earth, fire, air, and water, everything on earth, cumin, nutmeg, etc., was also thought to consist of the same elements, right? And this was very important in the way people, physicians, theorized why particular drugs could cure certain diseases, but we'll get there in a second. I have some more introductory images. So the body, from the 14th century onwards, we have these illustrations of the body. We don't know for sure the source of these illustrations by Mansour Ibn Iyas. They might be copies of illustrations coming from the Latin world, but this is an example of how the body was understood and illustrated in that time, which is, mind you, 5 centuries later, from that translation movement that I just spoke about. Here we have a 16th century illustration of a physician taking a woman's pulse. Taking pulse was very important to diagnose patients. Treatment included different things, among which the practice of cupping. Here we see an illustration from Al-Hariri's Maqamat, where a physician is trying to pull humors from the inside of the body to the surface using this instrument. This is from the Islamic Art Museum in Cairo, right? To try and pull the humors to the surface so that they can leave the body. Other ways was administering drugs through which you could get rid of excess humor. So you could make a patient throw up or have diarrhea, or, as has happening in this illustration in this bowl, use bloodletting to get rid of excess blood. Surgery was practiced as well. This is from a work by a surgeon from Andalusia called Zahrawi. These are illustrations of surgical instruments that were used at the time, and these are actual instruments from the Islamic Art Museum in Cairo from the medieval period. Now, in addition to these ways of treatment, right, so surgery, cupping, bloodletting, making patients throw up, physicians also use diets. So it's very important to eat healthy foods, to remain healthy, or also to get better. Of course, to sleep well and exercise well, but they also use drugs. And that's where I want to turn to now. The theory of drugs initially was based on Galenic ideas. So there was an understanding of simple drugs in Arabic, adwiya mufrada, and compound drugs, adwiya murakaba. So compound drugs being a combination of different simple drugs together in one medicine, right? And a simple drug just being one item, so cumin or nutmeg by itself. As soon as you are going to mix honey with cumin with nutmeg, you get a compound drugs. Galen explains this in On Simple Drugs and in another work of his, The Composition of Drugs According to Kinds. Now, each of the simple drugs are believed to have certain powers, effects, and benefits. They can be animal material, they can be vegetables, they can be mineral substances, right? But they, based on the amount of fire, water, air, etc. they consist of, they'll have a particular power, which will have a certain effect on a certain body, right? So the idea used to be, if you have a disease which is caused by being very cold, so having too many humors that will make the body cold, then what do you need to do? You need to restore the balance. So you need to give the patient a drug that is hot and that will make the body hot again, right? So traditionally, these drugs, these mixtures of the drugs, right, needed to contract the mixture of a disease. So this is the theoretical ideas that were inherited from Galen. In a very important figure that became authoritative in Islamic world was Dioscorides, who wrote a work in the 1st century AD called the Materia Medica. It covered circa 600 plants and about 1,000 different medicines. And I'm mentioning it here because it was translated into Arabic in the 9th century, and it really became an authority in the centuries afterwards. This illustration on this slide shows an image of Dioscorides in an actual 13th century copy of an Arabic translation of this text, which circulated. I have an example here of a particular drink that is the physician here is preparing to cure coughs, and it tells the reader to use myrrh, white pepper, etc., to pound them together, drink them with good wine, and put them in a clean bowl, and to drink the drug, the mixture after supper. This is another illustration from same Arabic translation where you see physicians or pharmacists preparing medicine from honey. I added the Quranic verse, from their bellies comes a drink, which is healing for people. In addition to this text, of course, there's different recipes in it. There's also a lot of focus on the on plants itself as simple drugs, right? There's also a different genre called akrabadin, which were specifically concerned with compound drugs. So very famous in the Arabic world was Sabuh ibn Sahal from 869 and Ibn at-Timith from 1165, who made collections of compound drugs that then became widely read. So far, I've laid out the influences, right, of Dioscorides, of Galen, and I've already mentioned that that physicians worked on this and developed this, but I think in no field was this as true. Well, in other aspects it was true too, but it was also very true in the field of drugs, that physicians very much started to depart from Greek practices as time moves on. And I'm giving you this quote from Ibn Jumay, who died in 1198, who writes that the ancients, and ancients, he means the Greeks, they have informed them about the fundamental principles from which you can know the strength of drugs, right, and how to test them, but they did not mention all kinds of drugs which physicians gather from all sorts of lands in their time in the 12th century and rely on, nor did they in the past comprehend all the benefits of the drugs that they mentioned. So they either didn't include all the drugs that they know in Ibn Jumay's time, nor did they understand the drugs that they did mention fully, right? So they overlooked benefits. So he's here explaining, and he almost has to defend this, that it's okay to depart from Galen, right? Because he's writing in a time where some would argue, well, that it would be disrespectful to deny the authority of previous scholars, right? So you had to explain yourself why that was okay to do, which is Ibn Jumay is doing here. So you see three things happening. Two of which Ibn Jumay mentions. One, the introduction of new known drugs as a result of trade, right, and interaction. There's more drugs known to people in the early Islamic world than were known to Greeks before then, right? You see the increase in knowledge of drugs that were already used, but also see, and I don't have a slide for that, but there's also a change in theory. You start seeing physicians using drugs that are supposed to be, that are cold and that are supposed to treat hot diseases are now being used to treat cold diseases, right? So the entire theoretical idea of that a hot drug needs to cure cold disease is discarded by certain physicians because they are testing and working with particular drugs and they see that it works to cure diseases, right? So as soon as they have the evidence that it does work, we see that people like Ibn Butlan write that physicians are departing with old practices. Now, very early on in Ibn Masawayh, for example, in the 9th century, he wrote a work called The Essences of Simple Perfumes or Aromatic Substances, Atib al-Mufrada. And he lists here a list of spices, right? For example, cloves and nutmeg that came from Asia, from Indonesia. So these were already used and known at this time. He also mentions some drugs that's really hard to identify, such as phalanga, also maize and anju. This is from Helen King's work. After Dioscorides, who I showed before, he was very influential. You start seeing many Islamic physicians compiling their own works of herbals, of simple drugs, and also I already mentioned of compound drugs. An example is Abu Jafar al-Ghafiqi, which has been edited a few years ago, or almost in 2014 by Jamil Rajab and Faith Wallace. You see that someone like al-Ghafiqi, who was, I think, an Andalusian physician, he will quote a lot of the drugs mentioned by Dioscorides and others, also other Greek physicians, but then add his own and also quote the material that's already mentioned by older Arabic physicians. So the body of known drugs that may work grows and grows and continue to grow. For instance, also in the work of Ibn Baitar, who was an Andalusian physician who moved to Cairo, where he became chief of botanists in the 13th century. And he wrote a very famous compendium on simple drugs and foods, as well as another complete work on simple drugs. And he lists 1,400 plants alphabetically, uses 20 Greek sources, but also over 150 Arabic sources. And he will include many of the plants and drugs known at his time that weren't known before. From the work by people in theoretical works, but also by everyday common people, spices that came from far away were incorporated and used to treat illnesses. The final example, back to a theoretical work again, is how spices end up in compound drugs. And for that, I want to go to an example from Ibn Sina's canon, who mentions a compound drug, al-shilta. And this example shows how complex compound drugs could be, right? So he mentions this drug and he lists the ingredients. So it consists of zeddery, doronicum, onboard pearls, coral, raw silk, alum, silver, gold, malabathrum, honey, pepper, saffron, and musk and other ingredients, right? So not only do individual or simple drugs begin to be used, they also are then developed to be used as part of compound drugs. So this was what I wanted to share with you about the evolvement, right, of pharmacology and the incorporation of spices from other regions and the effect that had of the physicians in the region innovated all the practices of Galenic medicine. And I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elaine van Dalen, who was speaking brilliantly about the state of cosmopolitan culture related to the spices, but also drugs, medical works, etc. So we have learned a lot about, for example, of course, from the very well-known theory of the Abbasid translation movement. There was a translation of science, philosophy, etc., from Greco tradition to Arabic culture. So here we have also learned a lot about the medical discipline, and we know from your presentation also some particular issues related to medical science, drugs, etc. So one simple question from me before we are reading some question from the participant, perhaps. We know from the Arabic kitabs, Arabic books in the past that for example, the terminology of At-Tibbun Nabawi, the prophetic medicine, does it related to the kind of the Galenic or the Greek medicine, or does it did it different from that one? So we want to learn a lot about this one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. That's a very interesting question. So the Tibb Nabawi or prophetic medicine was a, let's say, parallel medical tradition that developed in the Islamic world. Initially, you have in the hadith collections, you have collection of medical hadith. So there will be usually 40 hadith that relate to medicine or health, ways that the Prophet engaged in medicine. And in the centuries after, you start seeing that physicians and scholars write commentaries on these hadith. And some of them try to understand how the Galenic medicine can work together with hadith and the Quran, right? And you have different solutions. You have a scholar. There's a scholar called Ibn al-Jawziyah who says, for example, this idea of people consisting of water, fire, air, and earth. He says this cannot be true because if we read the Quran, then we see that fire is what the shaitan consists of. So human being cannot consist of fire, right? So he then changes the idea of these four elements. But in other places, he sees some Kalanic practice and it contradicts with some practice he reads in hadith. And sometimes he thinks this hadith, this medical practice only worked in Medina in this time, right? So he says we need to read it historically. So that was a separate tradition that was also influential for many Muslims in Islamic world. But the tradition of Ibn Sina and Razi, the scholar tradition, was separate from that.
Great, thank you. We have one question actually written in Arabic. Wonderful here. I would like to read Arabic first, and maybe my loose translation will be followed. سؤال واحد. وجدنا في كثير من الكتب الطبية العربية والإغريقية بعض مكونة الأدوية من البهارات مثل الفلفل والقرنفل والجوز طيب والقرفة والكافور وغير ذلك. كانت تلك البهارات أو الأقاقير الطبية من أصل الجزر الهندية ألا وهي إندونيسيا اليوم. So we found a lot of things from the prophetic books, I mean in Arabic and also in Greek, some notion about drugs and also spices, something like cornmeal, nutmeg, clove, etc. And there are also, this kind of spices. It comes from Al-Juzur al-Hindiya, so the archipelago of India, or Indian archipelago, which means it is Indonesia today. The question is, ما هو السياق الثقافي في تلك العصور التي تجعل بهارات أو الأقاقير إندونيسية تستعمل في كثير من أوصاف تركيب الأدوية الطبية ويظن أن تلك البهارات تملأ أسواق الشرق الأوسط وأوروبا في نفس العصور. So the question is, what is the cultural context of this kind of, the the transportation or the using of drug from Indonesia coming to the Middle East? Whether there are some kind of, the spices market in the Middle East or in Europe at the same time. Maybe you have some notion about the cultural context of this one. This is very interesting question written in Arabic. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I must say, I find that a very fascinating question myself too. I do think, as the asker of this question suggests themselves, that we need to place it in the context of trade, right? Of trade between these regions. That's definitely where I would search it, but it's a question that I would like to myself learn much more about, because the Indonesian, the influence is something I have not studied, but we clearly see the use and increased use of spices that come from this region. So that's our evidence that through trade and connections that must have arrived.
Sure. Thank you very much. Are there some questions from the participant here, offline perhaps? We can translate in English. I think we have about 5 to 10 minutes. If there are no questions more, so we will close. Mas Ulil, you would like to speak maybe directly to us? We have here Mas Ulil, Pak Michael Finner perhaps, who would like to ask some question or perhaps some insight.
Yes, Mas Zaki.
Yes, Mas Ulil,
This is
please.
Ulil.
Okay, please, Mas Ulil.
I have no specific question for Dr. Elaine, but I enjoy her presentation. It's very wonderful. I think a future scholarship should be pursued related to the relationship between Middle East or Arab worlds, or Middle East in general, and Malay worlds, because as a gentleman that's asked before me previously mentioned, the substances that were used in drug making that we see in the Arabic works, as Dr. Elaine presented to us, was originally from Indonesia, Nusantara, and from Sumatra perhaps from Java. Yeah. So I think is a lacuna, a void that should be filled in the future, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mas Ulil. Are there some comments or questions from the online participants? Aditya. Do you have some response, Dr. Elaine Van Dalen, maybe from the perspective of Ulil Absar Abdallah, our Indonesian scholar here?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think it's very very much necessary to continue this research and to understand the changes and development that happened in the Middle East, how it resulted from contact with the Malay world and Asian regions, which is a collaboration that doesn't often happen between scholars, right? So we see influence in the Middle East, but at least I myself, we don't trace that further. We for example will see, yes, they use pepper, but there will also be knowledge of how pepper, nutmeg, etc., how these spices are used, right, in different Asian regions. So that knowledge of that medical knowledge will have traveled to the Middle East as well, I assume. But those are just research questions that I agree are very fascinating and need to be studied.
Thank you very much. We have some question also from the participant. I just would like to read here. The first question is from Maria Fauzi. You have just mentioned in the presentation that Muslims increasingly play a significant role, writing treatises and books on medicine following their Christian counterparts. I am wondering what makes that happen. Did religion or religious doctrines play a role in Muslim enterprise in medicine? This is the first question. Maybe I just would like to read the second and the third one, and you can accumulate the answer in later. The second one from Riri Harira. Thanks for a wonderful presentation, Dr. Elaine Van Dalen. I would like to ask about whether those spices, medicine, and drugs tradition within medieval Islamic history that specifically address to woman health and well-being. Thank you. The third one from Hamim Toha, also Indonesian scholar. There is one question from Mrs. Elaine. Is camel urine, which is claimed to be a medicine, was it or is it popular in Islamic medical literature? So this is this is also, I mean, a nice question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for reading the questions, and thank you all for asking them. In regards to the first question, I think you see almost a natural development where in that first 9th century, a lot of people were still Christian, right? You have some Islamization happening, but over time, larger amounts of the population become Muslim, and also more physicians become Muslim. You will see that they participate in the same discourse, and yes, there will be influences from people's religion, but it's not as noticeable as you would see in Tibb an-Nabawi, in the prophetic medicine, where you very strongly see Muslim interpretation. But if you compare Christian and Muslim medical text of physicians working in the Greek tradition, you don't necessarily notice a difference. But I would say the biggest reason of an increased Muslim physicians would be increased Islamization and increased Muslims in the region. Yes, there will be drugs that would be specifically for women's health, because women were thought to have different kinds of bodies. They were more cold than men, so they will need at least other amounts or other kinds of medicine. I don't have an example ready right now, but that was taken into account. Camel urine, I think I've seen it. I don't want to, I can't measure how popular it is, but camel urine, other urines, bird poo, intestines, stomachs, all sorts of things were used. For your information. So I think those were the three questions that you read to me.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. I hear from the participant here that
I would like to ask to Mrs. Elaine Van Dalen. May I ask? My name is Mufti Ali from Banten. I would like to ask you, I found in the Dach register the information that the Sultan of Banten in 1670 was ill and almost passing away out of racun. And in the Dach register mentioned that he was severely ill for more than 3 weeks, and that information, of course, a very urgent information for the VOC in the Batavia. Therefore, it is informed very completely. And after several weeks, he recovered. I don't know what kind of medicine he used, and I'm sure that he was treated very, very well by the Orientalist or medicine. That is one one question. And other question is, the several soldiers of the VOC from Batavia, when war wars in Banten and they were wounded, they were treated in Batavia. I don't know whether it is in hospital or not. So one question that I would like to you, that there are 2 treatments. It seems to me one is Oriental herbal medicine that was the treatment for the Sultan of Banten, and the second one is Western medical treatment in Batavia. I would like to ask you some elaboration about this for me enigmatic phenomenon. Thank you very much, Mrs. Elaine Van Dalen. Mufti Ali from Banten.
Thank you. That sounds fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, we have actually some requests, Professor Michael Finner, to comment or ask something about this topic. Please, Pak Michael Finner.
Yes, thank you very much. And apologies for coming in a bit late. The time difference from Tokyo was such that I thought it started at 9 o'clock, not at 8:30. So apologies. Elaine, from what I heard of your talk, I was really excited to see you bringing this, especially into conversation with this audience in Indonesia. And one question that I've had for a while, and I don't know if you addressed it earlier in the talk, is really about sort of what we might be able to find out from the sources about the perception of these kinds of drugs and spices coming from Indonesia. So in the materials from medieval Cairo, for example, or in Sina, wherever you're looking at, do you have a sense that the potency and the effectiveness of these drugs was linked to the fact that they were exotic and expensive and from far away and somewhat mysterious? Or was some of the efficacy because it was folded in with, and this is related to Ulu's question a little bit, folded in with practices that traveled along with the substances, right? That is, they knew that this could help reduce a fever. They knew that this could help to prevent blood clotting, that sort of thing. So in general, do we have any way of gauging from the sources you've been looking at how much of this was the exotic from afar quality and how much of it was really folded into established patterns of practice that Muslim mariners and merchants might have come into contact with as they brought these materials across the Indian Ocean?
Thank you for your question. And I think it's a combination. So I think just to answer the first option, whether it has something to do with the exotic, I can actually speak to that there's some indication that that's true, not always, but there is such a thing as medicine for the poor and the rich. There's Gerrit Bos, who has published, for example, an edition of El Jazar's work. There were specific works of drugs and medical practices for the poor, and because they couldn't afford expensive medicine, so you needed to give them something that was cheap and that would work for them, but that wouldn't have included more expensive things. And in contrast to that, the rich wouldn't want the medicine for the poor. So something that could maybe work for them, they wouldn't want. There's some physicians complaining about that. They would want it to be more expensive and fancier things for it to be effective. So knowing that could be some hint that what you're suggesting about drugs coming from far, that some wealthy people would have found that more interesting. Now, your second suggestion, I think that's very plausible. I haven't seen necessarily reports that say we're using this because they used it there and they said it worked. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, because I haven't looked everywhere, right? But that would probably be an option. And I think in addition to the two options of you mentioned, I think with the import of new products, they might also have started to use things and note things and from their own experience at it. So I think these are all possibilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Michael Viner and also Elaine for your answer. I think we are resuming our event today, this morning. Yeah, thank you very much for all participants who are joining our event this morning. And I think this is something like the food for thought actually for us before entering our panels in some of the topics that we want to have some break rooms in our Zoom event today. Thank you again for your presentation, Elaine, and good night.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oke, thank you. Terima kasih untuk Bapak, Ibu, Mas, Mbak sekalian di Indonesia dan di seluruh dunia dimanapun Anda berada. Kami sudah selesai untuk acara pagi kali ini. Kita akan nanti melanjutkan ke acara berikutnya di beberapa panel. Silahkan Bapak, Ibu yang sudah mendaftar untuk mengikuti beberapa panel yang akan kami lakukan pada pukul 9.00. Kita memiliki waktu 10 menit ke depan. Thank you all, and I think we would like to say goodbye to Elaine and also some people in the United States, for example. Bye.
Goodbye.